Hello and welcome to Teaching Together. If you are joining us for the very first time, welcome. We are diving in today to one of our mini episodes in our current topic of looking at differentiation. So we're going to dive straight into the body of our episode for today. I'm here with Grace as usual.
Hello.
And we're going to be having a little bit of a chat about how we can think about supporting students with sensory differences in our classroom. So, Grace, do you want to tell us a little bit about sensory processing and what it is and how it impacts our work?
Yes. I think this is possibly, after intellectual considerations, this is the most significant impact on my differentiation practice in my current classroom. We're going to get into the different types of sensory, the different types of senses, and the fact that there might be more than 5.
Which I was genuinely gobsmacked, but anyway, very excited to talk more about that.
Yes. And I think because we are just as a society becoming so much more aware of neurodivergence and the different ways it presents itself, just the recognized instances of sensory needs have increased.
Yes.
And so I feel more able as a professional to look at students in my class and say, okay, this student is quote unquote misbehaving, but it actually is likely due to a sensory issue rather than they're just a quote unquote bad kid. For example, and I have quite a few students in my class that come to mind when I think of sensory issues. And it's very interesting trying to negotiate everyone's needs, including my own needs, because we're going to also get into under and oversensitivity and looking at a lot of the oversensitive columns in relation to the 8 senses that we could argue exist. I actually sit in the oversensitive column for almost all of them, which I find quite interesting, and undersensitive in one of them. Which one? That is sizzle for later. Stay tuned to find out. And so I have my own needs that help me perform well as a teacher, such as I don't love, and I think you relate to this, not having fluorescent lights on overhead all the time.
Yes.
And I've got my, because I'm in my own classroom all the time, I can have cozy lamps and things there, and my plants and oh my goodness, soft toys and pillows in the reading corner and things to just soften the space a bit.
Yeah.
And I can make those decisions for myself, but I have to make decisions on behalf of the students in my class. And also, so I have to identify the needs and then figure out, okay, how am I going to balance all these competing needs? And I'm thinking of a student in particular who is very oversensitive in some ways and very undersensitive in others, and just has outbursts sometimes and just marches off to the corner of the room and refuses to participate. And in that case, often I have to say, well, tough luck, sorry, I can't negotiate any more for you. Unfortunately, you're quite overstimulated, for want of a better term, and you're not coping, but for the good of the classroom, you actually need to deal with this. Other times I can say, okay, let's take a break. It might be more appropriate for this student to go outside of the classroom in our breakout space for a bit and calm down or do a different activity or blah, blah, blah. So I find it is juggling a lot of balls trying to manage everyone's sensory issues. And personally for me, it's the one area of differentiation that I'm probably most familiar with and comfortable dealing with, even more than intellectual differentiation, just because I also experience my own, like we all have sensory needs.
Yeah.
And I definitely experience some.
Yeah.
But I think there's a what's the word I'm looking for? There's a statistic in this document that we are reviewing that is by the Independent Schools Association of New South Wales, which is now just independent schools, not AAS. But anyway, apparently, according to some data from 2022, approximately 1 in 6 children experience difficulties with sensory processing, which in percentage terms is about 13 to 16% of typically developing children and up to 88% of those that we would call neurodiverse. Which is wild to me. I was saying before that I would have assumed that figure for neurodiverse children would be closer to 100%. But the fact that those stats pretty much just say there's two extremes.
Yeah.
There's a very small percentage of quote unquote typical children, and then a very large percentage of neurodiverse children are dealing with these sensory differences. And I totally see that in my classroom. The students that I would consider to be neurotypical definitely are more able to take things in their stride and kind of deal with the sensory demands of the classroom, like changing temperatures as I still fight with the air conditioning in this new building to try and get it to do what I want it to do. Yes. And, changing lights if we're watching a video and making the room dark versus light, and noise from outside and watching a video and all that sort of stuff. And you can kind of tell which children are more sensitive to input or sensory input, as we would say. And yeah, those ones are probably the ones I would say, yeah, you're definitely neurodivergent in some way. I can see these statistics really borne out in my room.
Yeah.
That was a lot of talking. I do apologize.
No, don't apologize. What I think is really interesting, just looking at this little graphic, and we will pop the link for this resource in the show notes. It breaks down the idea of sensory processing into three components. So there's a sensory input, like Grace just mentioned, which could be light, or it could be sound, or it could be temperature, or any piece of information really that is received through the senses. And then there's processing of that information. So the brain processes it and compares it to past experiences to try and interpret the information. And then the brain decides whether it's going to ignore the stimuli or react to the input. And what I think is really interesting, just referring back to some of my studies that I've done on in educational psychology, is just like, this has just popped into my mind right now. So I'm just kind of rambling on the fly. But we've spoken like way back in the show about, like working memory and different sort of capacities of how our memory functions. And there's a lot of research into working memory and sort of its capacity. But, the general consensus is that your working memory can hold about 4 to 7 pieces of information at once. And so we can all probably bring to mind students that we've taught or currently teach who we would describe as perhaps having a poor working memory. I actually think my working memory at the moment is atrocious. But anyway, that just also comes from trying to like hold so many things at once. We just can't. Sometimes we expect a little too much of our brains. But what I remember learning about when I was sort of first doing some research into this is that even senses form some of that information that we're trying to hold in our working memory. So, if we're going to roll with the sort of the general vibe that, let's say, our brains can only hold 7 pieces of information, some of that information is coming from our senses. It's not like all, numerical information or some sort of other qualitative or quantitative piece of information. Sometimes it might be a piece of sensory input that your brain is also trying to juggle and process at the same time as it's trying to juggle and process all the other things. And so, part of our working memory's job is actually, if we're sitting in a classroom and we see someone walk past the window, that's a bit of sensory input that we've just received. Are we going to ignore that? Is it irrelevant, or are we now going to react to that? And so all of those other things that are happening in your room, around your room, all the different pieces of sensory input that your students are experiencing has an impact on their working memory and their ability to engage with the task at hand as well, because they're constantly processing all of those pieces of information and trying to decide, is this important? Can I, for want of a better word, like, can I let go of this piece of information? Is it irrelevant? Can I ignore it? Or do I need to now react to it by, asking the teacher to turn the aircon on, or, something like that? Like, do I need to react or do I need to ignore? And what we're trying to think about here is how do we differentiate to support students with these sensory differences? Because I know for myself, like when I was a first year teacher, thinking about differentiation for supporting students with these kinds of differences would not have been the top of my priority list. I would not have been thinking about this when I'm thinking about differentiation. My first thought would be, okay, I've got to make multiple versions of this task, or, add some spicy levels, or, do I have an extension activity, or do I have a this, or do I have a that? And it's all from a learning perspective. But what we need to stop and remember is that sensory input takes up space in our brain. And so it is impacting our students' ability to learn and engage with information and engage in learning activities. And so if we aren't differentiating and being aware of the sensory differences or the sensory inputs that might be around our in and around our room and that are being processed by our students, then we could have the perfectly leveled task for their ability. We could have the perfect extension activity. But if their brains are caught up in processing or not processing the right kinds of inputs, then it's going to be impeding their learning. So it's really important for us to think about sensory processing and how that's impacting students in our classroom, because every single one of our students are doing this. Every single one of them are engaging with sensory processing. And like Grace mentioned before, there's certain stats around how many of them experience difficulties with processing that. But it's really important that we think about it because it has a direct impact on their sense of safety, which we've spoken about a lot, about wanting to have safe classrooms. It impacts their attention span, so that sort of ties in with working memory, and also their ability to regulate their emotions.
So, we promised you talk about the 8 senses. The 5 that you are familiar with are referred to as the external senses, which are hearing, sight, taste, smell, and touch, or if you want to be fancy, auditory, vision, gustatory, olfactory, and tactile senses.
I do want to be fancy.
Because gustatory and olfactory are very fun. And we're not going to spend any time on those because you know what they are. The fun additional 3 are called internal senses. These are vestibular, proprioception, and interoception. Vestibular is about balance and spatial orientation, how you know how fast or slow you're moving. This is all the inner ear stuff. And there's some fluid in there apparently, and that's why, is that why I get car sick? I don't know. Something to do with that, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know the mechanics
No
of that.
idea. Anyway, so that's what vestibular senses, that's what the vestibular sense is. Proprioception is kind of how you know where your body is in space, and this document refers to it as your internal eyes. We actually did an experiment in my classroom with this for some reason that I can't remember now. Oh, we were looking at our 5 senses, and we were looking at, there was a video where they talked about this proprioception sense, and it's how if you're in a familiar space and you close your eyes, you kind of know where you're going and you can kind of feel, oh, I'm getting close to something because maybe the hairs on your arm are standing up or whatever. You're like, ooh, I know where I am, even though my eyes are closed. And the last one is interoception, which is how you know you're hungry, thirsty, nervous, et cetera, et cetera. And on each of the 8 senses, so all the external ones that we're already familiar with and the internal ones, you can be oversensitive or undersensitive or normal sensitive. But because we're looking at sensory difficulties and differences, we're going to look at undersensitive and oversensitive. And I can already think of some students in my class that are experiencing both of these things. And I was saying before that I'm quite oversensitive in a lot of ways, but my interoception is quite undersensitive. I'm one of those people who will sit down to do work for ages and then realize I'm busting to go to the toilet and I'm about to pass out because I'm really hungry. That kind of thing. But pretty much all the other ones, I'm quite sensitive to things, which is why I like my room quiet and I turn off the overhead lights lots of times. And I'm a really fussy eater, and I'm going to blame that on my gustatory sensitivity. And not that I'm just a child. Stuff like that. And so if students are oversensitive, they may be sensory avoidant, which is when they just avoid a situation. Or if I've heard this term a lot, students can be sensory seeking, and that's when they're undersensitive. And I'm thinking of a particular student in my class whose occupational therapist has identified them as having proprioceptive sensory seeking behaviors. Which sounds very fancy, but basically their proprioception is undersensitive. And so this child will lean on furniture or throw themselves onto the floor. The OT has recommended things like doing wall push-ups, or maybe just doing push-ups on a chair. So you literally just put your hands on either side of your butt when you're on a chair and just push up and down. Doing stomping walks, that kind of thing, just to get that really intense sensory input. And those kind of activities are designed to help this student regulate. But yeah, I just thought that's an example that came to mind immediately, because I'd never heard of this term proprioceptive senses or proprioception before this year. And when I heard it used for this particular child, it just made a lot of things make more sense. As we know, all behavior is communication. And yeah, that knowing that this is an undersensitivity in the proprioception and then oversensitivity in other things has helped me understand this student a lot better and has helped me when I'm writing their individual plan in consultation with their parents. It's really helped me to get into the more nuanced and personalised aspects of differentiation, which is part of our quality teaching practice.
Yeah, so for a student like that, like you might, as part of their learning plan, have very specific movements that you're sort of encouraging them to do through the day, like you were saying, the wall push-ups and things like that. Because I guess if you are helping them channel and regulate their movement in like safe and helpful ways, then that's going to help to avoid unsafe and unhelpful behaviors that might be them trying to regulate their regulate their proprioceptive senses like in a different way. And so I think it's such an interesting aspect of differentiation that, again, I just would not have thought about when I first stepped out of uni and into school. I think about some of my classrooms that I taught in my first year, like some of them were, so dark and so just poorly lit and all these other things. And I think, wow, that would not have been a pleasant sensory environment. But if we just think quickly to our multi-tiered framework that we spoke about in the last episode, some of those classic tier 1 supports that you already mentioned that you have in your classroom, like visual timetables, visual timers, environmental cues, they can be super helpful for those like universal tier 1 supports that are going to help everybody in the room, but especially those who have sensory differences and are oversensitive or undersensitive in various ways. I think we've already spoken before about, my like oversensitivity to light. And so I'll often forget to turn the lights on in my classroom and someone walks past and they're like, why are your lights off? And I said, if you have to turn them on, that's fine. Because we get a lot of natural light into our classroom. And so I don't feel the need to have additional artificial light on top of that. And then I also struggle with migraines. So at certain points in time, I can become oversensitive to some of those extra things, but it's not 100% of the time. And so even that, like some of our students might be experiencing over or under sensitivity to certain things at certain times, but not all the time. And some of the research also shows that we might see these sensitivities more or less, depending on how motivated the student is to engage in the activity that's happening in your classroom. If they love art and you're in an art lesson and you might notice that the way that they regulate and manage their sensory input is very different to how they're regulating and managing themselves in another context, because their motivation and willingness to engage in the learning activity does also sometimes impact their ability to kind of regulate their sensory input as well. So that's just something to keep in mind, because variation that we see in our students, maybe across different subjects or across different rooms, doesn't mean that they don't experience those differences. It just might mean that their motivation is different in each of those places or circumstances, and that's having an impact on their ability to also process those sensory inputs at that particular time and place. Our Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports in this instance would involve those kinds of things where you might have an IP that allows students to have particular breaks or sit on a particular style of chair or use some sort of fidget device, or, for me in high school, it often can look like certain students that might wear loops to reduce auditory input, or it might be that student who just always wears their hat inside and you want to tell them to take it off. But it would be worth exploring that, because potentially they might be feeling, they might have an oversensitivity to light in your room, and that's why they're always wearing their hat, which they may or may not be aware of as the reason for why they're doing that. As we know, being good teachers means that we know our students and how they learn. And so one of the most important things that we can do is pay attention to how they are processing and managing sensory input in your classroom environment, and think carefully about whether there's something you can do to make their sensory processing more manageable and better regulated, especially when there is such high percentages of students who are going to have differences and difficulties with this in your class. If the number is 1 in 6, we're talking like probably at least 4 to 5 students in your class that would experience difficulty with their sensory processing. So I think that's a really helpful number for us to keep in mind as we maybe reset our classrooms for the term, or as you think about what sorts of activities you might be doing. Just pay some careful attention, because this is an important part of our differentiating and our teaching practice as well.
Amen. I have no further additions.
Okay, let's call it quits there.
Go us.
We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.